Hey everyone, so this week's 2-minute video is going to be a little history lesson based off a grave that I visited down in St. Louis when I was there, and that is the grave of Dred Scott. Now, do you know the history of Dred and Harriet Scott and why they're so important in our history? You should. So let's learn. Dred and Harriet Scott were slaves who lived in St. Louis in the 1800s. Now, Dred Scott was in his late 40s in 1846 when him and his wife, Harriet, filed for their own freedom under Missouri law. This fight would last 11 years. Now, initially, they filed separately. They figured that even if Dred's petition for this freedom was denied, maybe Harriet and their children's would be accepted. However, the court wouldn't allow them to do that, and they made them file just one lawsuit for their freedom. So Dred claimed in the lawsuit that because they had lived in the Illinois and Wisconsin territories for 4 years where slavery was illegal, that they should not be slaves still, that they should be free. Because if a slave owner had somebody as their property for an extended period of time in a free area, they would give up their right. Their battle started at the old courthouse in St. Louis, where you can still go and see a big plaque and statue that are there in memory of Dred and Harriet. It went from the courthouse up to the U.S. Supreme Court. After a 10 to 11 year battle, it was finally decided in a vote of 7-2 that Dred and Harriet were still slaves. Now, what was really courageous about this was any time during this process, their owner could have separated them, killed them, sent them to different parts of the world, but they didn't. So that was one thing that worked in their favor during this time, is that they remained together. Now, this whole court battle went on to kind of light the fire under the butt of Abraham Lincoln. The court verdict came in 1857. Now, by a turn of events, the people who owned Dred and Harriet, the man died and the woman remarried, and the gentleman she married was very opposed to slavery. So she then transferred ownership to the Blow family. The Blow family was very good to Dred and Harriet. So on September 17th, 1858, Dred Scott died of tuberculosis. He had only lived 16 months as a free man. But the Blow family, still taking care of the Scotts and helping them, paid for Dred's burial at the Wesleyan Cemetery. But shortly later, in 1867, they moved him over to Calvary Cemetery, which is where I saw his grave space. Now, it was a Catholic cemetery at the time, and you had to have someone sponsor you for burial there, which is one of the reasons they say Dred is buried there at Calvary Cemetery, and his wife, whose grave space was found many, many years later in a different cemetery, that they were not buried together, is because she most likely didn't have a Catholic sponsor to place her next to Dred in Calvary Cemetery. However, a cenotaph was placed on the grave space next to Dred for her. Now, as we remember, a cenotaph is a grave space that is marked, but the person is not actually buried there. So Harriet was buried over at Greenwood Cemetery, and in 2006 is when her grave space was finally located. And now, years later, we know where she is and where he is. Calvary Cemetery is over 470 acres of graves and land. There are many notable people there buried alongside Dred Scott, like the playwright Tennessee Williams and Civil War General Sherman, who did Sherman's March to the Sea, that you can look that up. So I visited their grave spaces as well. One question many people ask when they are at Dred Scott's grave space is, why are there all these pennies? Well, if you remember, Abraham Lincoln's on the penny. Well, years later, when Abraham Lincoln became president, the arguments for freedom that Dred Scott and Harriet used were later used by Lincoln as a base to the Emancipation Proclamation. Dred and Harriet's work was a driving force for freedom for all slaves. Even though they lost their battle and their lawsuit, they set the groundwork for everything to come later. And so people will leave pennies on the grave space for Dred Scott just as a nod to what they began in that lawsuit they filed many years ago. So that's a brief history for you on Dred Scott and his very important place in history.